Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling the live-action Avatar, the Last Airbender series on Netflix. You know, the one that everyone's been talking about.
Oh, I definitely remember the one.
You sent us a YouTube video essay, and the title's pretty blunt. Avatar, the Last Airbender, the art of missing the point.
Ouch! Sounds like someone didn't pull any punches.
Not really. The essay digs into why fans feel this adaptation doesn't quite capture the magic of the animated show.
I get that. Avatar's got such a dedicated fan base. Expectations are sky high for something like this.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
And the essayist doesn't mince words, calling the adaptation mid. Like, not terrible, but not great either.
Mid. I've heard that a lot about this series. It's kind of in this awkward middle ground, isn't it?
Right. So we're diving in to see what's going on, what works, what doesn't.
Always a good idea to unpack these things. Adaptations are tricky, especially with a property as iconic as Avatar. Trying to stay true to the source material while also bringing something new to the table, it's a tightrope walk.
For sure. And this essayist seems to be grappling with that, trying to figure out where the adaptation succeeds and where it stumbles.
Makes sense. Well, let's jump in. Where do they start?
They do point out some positives, like the visuals and the music.
Okay, so at least it's got that going for it.
Yeah, they say the world looks and feels like the cartoon come to life, which visually must be pretty impressive.
I can see that. The animation style of the original was so unique and vibrant, it would be a shame if they didn't try to capture that.
Exactly. And they say that music builds effectively on the original themes. So that's a plus for fans of the soundtrack.
Yeah, music can really make or break the mood and atmosphere. Sounds like they at least got that right.
They also highlight some of the casting choices as strengths. Daniel Day Kim as Fire Lord Ozai, for instance.
Oh, interesting. I can actually see that working really well. He's got that intensity.
Right. And they like Gordon Cormier as Aang and Ian Ousley as Sokka. But then they move on to what they see as the adaptation's biggest issue, the writing.
Uh-oh. Here comes the butt.
Pretty much. They really go after the dialogue. They call it clunky and say it over-explains everything. Like, instead of letting the story unfold naturally, the characters just spell everything out.
I can see how that would be frustrating. Subtlety can be so powerful.
Totally. And they bring up Zuko as a prime example. In the animation, his journey from villain to hero is gradual, his vulnerability slowly revealed. But the essayist says the live action makes his inner conflict way too obvious from the start.
So no mystery, no slow burn, just bam, here's Zuko's emotional baggage.
Basically. And they argue that this lack of subtlety diminishes the impact of his eventual redemption arc. It's like we're told how to feel about him instead of discovering it for ourselves.
Interesting. It does seem like a lot of adaptations struggle with that. They want to make sure everyone's on the same page, so they over-explain things. But in doing so, they can lose that sense of discovery, that aha moment when things click for the audience.
Right. It's like they don't trust us to figure things out. And this over-explaining, the essayist argues, is a problem throughout the whole adaptation. They say characters are constantly stating their motivations and feelings directly, instead of letting us infer them through their actions.
Yeah, it's almost like they're afraid of leaving any room for interpretation. And that can really flatten out the characters.
Exactly. It's like tell, don't show, taken to the extreme. And the essayist seems particularly disappointed with how Katara is portrayed.
Ah, right. She's such a fan favorite. What's their issue with her?
Well, in the animated series, she's this strong, compassionate, and complex character. But in the live action, the essayist says she's stripped of her agency. She comes across as more passive, less assertive, and ultimately less interesting.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift. Katara was such a force in the original, both as a waterbender and as a leader. It would be a shame to see her character diminished in the adaptation.
Exactly. And unfortunately, it's not just Katara. The essayist also criticizes the portrayal of Azula. You know, in the animated series, she's this terrifying villain, totally driven by her need for perfection and control.
Oh yeah, Azula. She was a force to be reckoned with. What did they do with her?
Well, the essayist says her menacing confidence is gone, replaced with insecurity and, well, they actually use the word whining.
No way. Azula. Whining. That's almost hard to imagine.
I know, right? It's a pretty drastic change.
Yeah.
And then there's Boomy, who gets completely reimagined in the live-action version.
Oh no, not Boomy. That hilarious episode where he pretends to kidnap Aang's friend.
Yeah, that one. Well, forget it. In the live action, it's a serious revenge plot.
What? Seriously, they took all the fun out of it.
Apparently. The essayist calls it a travesty.
Wow, that's harsh. But I can see where they're coming from. That episode really showcased Boomy's playful personality and his deep affection for Aang. To turn it into something so dark and serious is a pretty big departure.
Yeah, it seems like a fundamental misunderstanding of the character. And it's interesting, the essayist points out that the live-action series, even though it has a similar runtime to the first season of the animated show, feels rushed.
Really? How is that even possible?
Well, they suggest that the original's episodic nature allowed for more organic character development. Like, there was time for things to breathe, for those smaller moments that build up to the bigger events.
I see. So by trying to condense everything, the live action might be sacrificing those character-driven moments that made the original so compelling.
Exactly. And it's not just the pacing. They also criticize changes made to the lore, like how Aang can only talk to past avatars in their specific domains. In the original, he could connect with them pretty much anywhere.
That's a pretty significant change. In the animated series, Aang's connection to past avatars was this source of wisdom and guidance, a way for him to learn from their experiences. Limiting that access could have some pretty big implications for his journey.
Absolutely. And they point out a bunch of other stuff, too, like the omission of Jiang Zhong, a character who played a crucial role in Aang's understanding of firebending.
Oh, Zhong. I loved him. He was so wise and mysterious.
Right. And he taught Aang some really important lessons about the dangers of unchecked power.
Yeah.
But he's just gone in the live action.
Wow. It sounds like they're streamlining things a bit too much. And what about Gran?
Oh, they don't hold back on their critique of her. They find her portrayal cringeworthy, full of clunky exposition. They even mention how awkward it felt when she recited the opening narration from the cartoon.
Oof, that's rough. Gran was such a warm and wise presence in the animated series. It sounds like they really missed the mark with her in the live action.
And then there's the whole storyline with Master Paku and Katara's training in the Northern Water Tribe. They felt it missed an opportunity to showcase Katara's strength and determination.
I remember that storyline. It was so powerful. Katara challenging those sexist traditions and proving herself as a waterbender, it was a real highlight of the original series.
Right. And the essayist argues that the adaptation simplifies things too much, attributing Paku's change of heart more to his past relationship with Katara's grandmother than to Katara's own efforts. I can see how that would be frustrating. It's like they're taking away Katara's agency, making her success dependent on someone else's actions rather than her own merits.
Exactly. And you know what else they missed? During Aang's meeting with Avatar Roku, Roku doesn't mention Sozin's comet.
Wait, what? No Sozin's comet. But that was like a major plot point in the original, the looming threat that added so much urgency to Aang's quest.
I know, right? It's a pretty big omission. And the essayist goes on to criticize the adaptation's handling of the secret tunnel scene, Zuko's Agni Kai with Admiral Zhao, and the depiction of the spirit world. They basically feel that these changes, both big and small, ultimately detract from the original story.
So not a glowing review so far.
Not exactly. It seems like the adaptation struggles to find that balance between honoring the source material and establishing its own identity. They make these big swings, but they don't always connect. Makes you wonder if they tried to cram too much into too little space, sacrificing character development and emotional depth for the sake of hitting the major plot points.
And speaking of character development, they make this really interesting point that Zuko is basically the only character who gets any substantial development throughout the whole season.
Really? So Ankiang and Katara, the heart of the original series, are just kind of there.
It seems that way. The essayist finds it baffling that Aang doesn't spend any time learning waterbending in this entire season.
No water bending at all. But that was such a crucial part of his journey in the original. It wasn't just about learning the element. It was about learning patience, flexibility, connecting with his emotions.
Feels like a huge missed opportunity. And it makes you wonder how they're going to handle Kang's progression as the Avatar if they're skipping over such a fundamental part of his training.
Right. It's like they're trying to fast track his development, but in doing so, they might be losing the heart of his journey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not a glowing review by any means, but as the essayist points out, it could have been a lot worse.
Well, that's something, I guess. At least it's not a complete disaster. Is that the bar we're setting for these adaptations these days?
It kind of feels that way, doesn't it? But still, it makes you wonder, is mid good enough for Avatar?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, it's a question that every fan has to answer for themselves.
True. We've heard what the essayist thinks, but now I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. What was your experience watching this adaptation?
Yeah, what parts resonated with you? What parts fell flat? Let's dive into your perspective in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we spent that last part really digging into the video essayists' take on the live-action Avatar. And yeah, they had a lot to say, especially about how the adaptation handled the characters and, oh man, that dialogue.
Yeah, it sounds like they thought the adaptation missed what made the original so good. Like
Like,
they liked the visuals and the way it looked, but not the heart of the story.
it's like they're saying it's a beautiful shell, but empty inside. They bring up some good points about like Katara and Azula and Bumi, like how they're just not the same as their animated counterparts.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The essayist said the writers focused too much on the plot and not enough on the characters. Like they didn't give them enough space to breathe and grow.
And that's what made those characters so relatable in the first place, right? Their
Okay.
flaws and their struggles. But here, it's like the writers are just telling us what to think about them.
Yeah, exactly. Like here's Zuko, he's conflicted. Here's Katara, she's strong, but we don't really see it. We're just told.
It's like they think we're not smart enough to figure it out on our own, which is kind of insulting, you know?
Totally. And that over-explaining in the dialogue just makes it worse. Like, hey, audience, just in case you missed it, this character is feeling sad right now.
It's like they think we need everything spelled out. No nuance, no subtlety. And the irony is, it actually makes the story less engaging.
Right, because part of the fun of watching a good story is figuring things out for yourself, connecting the dots, picking up on those subtle hints. But when everything is so obvious, it takes away that sense of discovery.
Exactly. And speaking of things that are obvious, the essayist also mentioned the pacing. They thought it felt really rushed, even though the live action has about the same runtime as the first season of the cartoon.
I remember that part. How can it be rushed if it has the same amount of time? It doesn't make sense.
Well, they were saying that the original's episodic format allowed for more, like, organic pacing. Like, there was time for those quiet moments, those little character interactions that build up to the bigger events.
I see. So by trying to fit everything in, they might be cutting out those smaller moments, the ones that actually make us care about the characters.
Right. It's like they're so focused on hitting all the major plot points that they forget about the journey. And they also talked about some changes to the lore. Like, a man can only talk to past avatars in certain places now.
Yeah, that one was weird. Why would they change that? In the original, it was like this special connection. He could reach out to them whenever he needed guidance.
And it wasn't just about getting advice. It was about feeling connected to something bigger than himself. Feeling like he wasn't alone in this whole avatar thing.
It was about legacy and history, all those past lives, all that wisdom and experience. It was a powerful element of the story.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then there were those key events that were just gone. Like John Jiang, who taught Aang so much about firebending, he's completely absent in the live action.
Oh, I remember that. He was so strict, but like he knew he cared about Aang, and those lessons were so important. Aang almost lost control, remember? That whole thing with the forest fire.
Right. And the essayist also pointed out that Aang doesn't spend any time learning waterbending in the live action.
Wait, seriously, he doesn't learn waterbending at all.
Apparently not. And that just seems crazy to me. Because that whole arc in the original was about so much more than just the bending. It was about patience and going with the flow and learning to connect with his emotions.
Right. It was a turning point for him. He was finally starting to embrace his destiny, but also like grow as a person.
Exactly. So, yeah, it sounds like the live-action Avatar misses the mark in a lot of ways.
And it's not just about the individual changes or omissions, it's the feeling, the tone of the adaptation. It doesn't have that same sense of wonder and magic that the cartoon did.
They really hammered that point home, didn't they? Like with Ko the Face Stealer, for example. He was so creepy and unsettling in the animated series. But here, it's like they just went for the visual spectacle without capturing that, like, unsettling feeling.
Yeah, it's like they focused so much on making it look cool that they forgot about the atmosphere, the mood. And that's what really stuck with you after watching the original.
It was subtle. Like, it got under your skin. This just feels dot surface level. And then there was that comparison to the Disney live-action remakes. Ouch.
Right. That was a pretty harsh critique. Like, both Netflix and Disney are just churning out these remakes without any real artistic vision, just cashing in on nostalgia.
But there's nothing wrong with nostalgia, right? I mean, I love revisiting those stories.
No, of course not. But it's like, what's the point if it's not adding anything new? If it's not, like, reimagining the story in a way that's meaningful and relevant for today's audience?
Exactly. It's like they're just going through the motions, hitting the same beats, without understanding what made the original so special. And the essayist even ended on a kind of depressing note, saying that Naruto is next on the live-action chopping block.
Yeah, it's like they've given up hope. Like, this is just what we expect from adaptations now. Mediocrity.
But doesn't have to be that way,
Yeah.
right? There are good adaptations out there. So what makes the difference? What are your thoughts?
That's a great question. What did you think of the live-action Avatar? Did it live up to your expectations?
So we've talked a lot about what the essayist thought, but now I'm curious, what about you? What was your experience watching the live-action Avatar?
Yeah, what jumped out at you, good or bad?
I mean, the essayist really focused on those changes to the characters, like Katara and Azula and Bumi. How did those changes sit with you?
Did you feel like they got those characters right, or did they miss the mark? Like with Katara, for instance, the essayist thought she was way too passive compared to the original.
Yeah, she has such a powerhouse in the animated series, but here it's like they took away her fire. What did you think?
And what about Boomy? That whole revenge plot thing, did that sit right with you?
I mean, I loved that episode in the original where he's just messing with Ongang, testing him. It just felt so different, you know?
Totally. And they also made some changes to the lore, like that whole thing with Ongang and the past avatars. What'd you make of that?
Like, why limit his access to them? That connection was so important in the original. It gave him guidance and support.
Yeah, it was like a lifeline to his past lives, to all that wisdom and experience. Did you miss that in the live action?
And what about all those things that were just left out? Like Zhang. Zhang, he was such a great character, and his lessons were so important for Aang.
I know, right? He had that whole tough love thing going on. I'm really needed that guidance, especially with firebending.
Exactly. And the fact that Aang doesn't even learn waterbending in this whole season, that just blew my mind.
Seriously, no waterbending. That's a big chunk of the original story missing.
I know. It felt like a huge missed opportunity to explore his growth, not just as a bender, but as a person.
So, where do you land on this whole mid-rating that the essayist gave it? Do you agree, or would you put it somewhere else on the adaptation spectrum?
Did it live up to your hopes? Fall short? Were there parts that you actually liked, even with all the problems we talked about?
Yeah. What are your final thoughts? Was this a good adaptation, or just a pale imitation of the original?
I guess the big question is, does this live-action Avatar stand on its own, or does it just make you want to rewatch the animated series?
It's definitely a lot to think about. Adapting something like Avatar is a huge challenge, and I think this deep dive has shown us just how tricky it can be to find that balance between staying true to the original and bringing something new to the table.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the live-action Avatar. It's been a wild ride, and I'm sure the debate will continue to rage on.
Absolutely. But hey, that's part of what makes these conversations so interesting, right? So until next time, keep exploring, keep those minds curious, and remember, there's always more to uncover.